Hello, my name is Nia, and today I'm going to be talking about the film Kirikou and The Sorceress. Kirikou and The Sorceress is a film that was produced in 1998 and directed by Michel Ocelot. The film is based on West African folklore and it is set in the same region. The story follows Kirikou, a newborn baby who, upon his birth, learns of the evil Karaba the Sorceress, rumored to have taken the men of the village and eaten them. Among these men includes all but one of Kirikou's uncles, so he joins his remaining uncle to confront Karaba and help his village with their problems and rescue Karaba from the evil that is afflicting her that she is exerting upon his people. The film had a mostly positive reaction from the places that it was released in. It was not released in the US and some other Western countries due to its depictions of nudity, as the women in the film are mostly depicted as being bare-chested, so they thought the nudity was inappropriate for children. Internationally, it did do pretty well. They had different versions released with translated voiceovers. Hayao Miyazaki, the director, this animation director from Studio Ghibli, he supported Kirikou, and he is the one who produced the Japanese voiceover of the film. There was also a Portuguese edition that was released in Brazil, as well as a Swahili version that was released. In France, the movie did extremely well. It had two sequels, Kirikou and the Wild Beasts and Kirikou and the Men and Women, as well as a stage adaptation, Kirikou and Karaba. It had a really big impact on the French animation industry because at the time, the animation industry was very US dominated with Disney. So the success of Kirikou showed that French animation can be profitable in France, so it was really making strides. Did it make strides in terms of West African representation as well? Many of the sources I read cited that Kirikou is the best that you can get in terms of a European translating and interpreting the work of a different culture. However, I think that in the case of Kirikou, there is a problem in the premise itself, as it says it is an adaptation of West African folklore, but West African folklore is not a monolith. It is inclusive of a variety of different places and cultures, each with their unique folklore, histories, and culture. This is a truth that is not reflected in Kirikou, and it plays into the idea of a homogeneous African culture, which is an idea that stems back to colonialism. And it plays into preconceived notions that people have of African people and of Black people as a whole. Why does it do that? So we need to get into the history of the relationship between West Africa and France. So West Africa is inclusive of 12 different countries. Not all of them have been colonized by France, such as Nigeria, but many of them have. West Africa, so the French colonized portions of West Africa. The story is not explicit in its origins, so it doesn't cite one particular story. It says that it kind of drew from a wide inspiration. But Michel Ocelot spent his childhood in Guinea and said that he was particularly inspired from his upbringing there. Additionally, many of the actors in the film are Senegalese. The voice actors in the French version of the film are Senegalese or French Senegalese, so perhaps that's another specific country that he was trying to represent or draw from. But yeah, it's not explicit in which story it drew from, but Michel Ocelot does cite that he was inspired by a series, an anthology of West African folklore written by François Equilbecq. And in order to further inspect this, you have to understand that François Equilbecq was a colonial administrator to West Africa, and many colonial administrators would spend their free time outside of their work analyzing and learning about the folklore of Africa. So when you're looking and you're reading at transcribed written versions of West African folklore, trying to understand it, many of it does come from these sources, or there's a lot of these sources out there. In Francophone Fairy Tales in West Africa and the Caribbean by Andrew Teverson, he explains how during the colonial period, French anthropologists and administrators would study African folklore in an attempt to dissect understandings of Black people from it. So you already have the kind of generalization of a people. So in the stories, not only are they pointing to, oh, I'm touching on these specific cultures, and these cultures equal all of West Africa, but they're also saying these cultures in West Africa equate to the entirety of Black people as a whole. So you already have this kind of divisive nature in trying to understand and get at the nature of these people. This is seen specifically in François Equilbecq's work, where in the text that I read, I couldn't get access to all his texts, but in the text that I read, he speaks about how he did not go to every single group and culture in West Africa, but he says that his work justifies the name because with the dominance of France coming along and the exchange of thoughts and values in Africa, which hadn't happened before, that all of these differences would whittle out, so he can just claim it to be generally West African. In addition to that, he states that in order to dominate a person, a people, you have to understand their weaknesses. So that is also his motivation for doing this work, is to figure out the weaknesses of the Black people in order to colonize them efficiently. So he's looking for their weaknesses, and he even states them. He says that one of the weaknesses of Black people is their pride and their indulgence in laziness. He also notes of their sexual violence and their amorality. So you can kind of see how even the analyzations of their folklore directly alludes to a lot of the modern stereotypes people have of African and of Black people today, because, you know, this is a textbook for racism. Additionally, the works, they are a translation. So using François Equilbecq's work as an inspiration directly for Kirikou does have its problems because it's not in its authentic form. François Equilbecq writes how there are some things that could not be translated directly. He did work directly with African translators who even said they're more their work than mine. But at the same time, these stories are oral stories and they're told with different uses of onomatopoeia and with different hand movements. It's necessary to a genuine telling of the story and carrying on of the tradition. So if you're basing it on these works that don't carry those traditions, then you're already kind of straying away from what the origin is. Additionally, François Equilbecq writes how he has to feign interest in order to gain the trust of the indigenous people of Africa, in order for them to tell him his stories. He says at first the African people are kind of reserved about telling their stories to a European or to a white person, but once he feigns interest, pretends that he respects and values their culture, then they will open up. But I think that still you have to question, are they telling you everything in its purest form? A different colonial administrator even kind of states this. He says that I have made every effort to remain always as close as possible to the original, yet one should not expect a servile imitation in this regard. This was François Roger, who was another French colonial administrator, so he's kind of admitting it. And he did try to translate as close as possible, but you can't expect the original tale. So this is the historical background to the stereotypes that are created about West African folklore, how France views West Africa and its folklore, honestly how France views West Africa through its folklore, how it uses folklore to draw different conclusions about African and Black people. And now I'm going to get into the story of Kirikou and see how Kirikou kind of follows along these lines in a lot of senses. So I couldn't find a specific story that Equilbecq wrote that had a lot of similarities to Kirikou. He does mention a kind of indigenous trope. So in his work, he categorizes different things. He says that you only find in indigenous folklore. This is things that you only find in European folklore. These are the weaknesses of the indigenous people. These are all of these different things. One of the things that he mentions is that there is a trope of and he cites different stories for these things. He says that there is a trope of a newborn child speaking in the womb and basically kind of giving birth to himself. This is the case in Kirikou. I couldn't find one specific story that had a lot of similarities to Kirikou. I did find one story called Debbo, Engal, and Fereyel, which I feel did fit that bill. It had a lot of similarities to Kirikou, and to me, it seemed like it could be the primary inspiration. Now, the thing with Debbo, Engal, and Fereyel is that I couldn't find I could not trace it back to one specific African story. So it comes from a radio audio recording called Spirits and Spooks for Halloween, recorded by William Conrad. And I could not find a story by the same name coming from an African tribe, but I did find a different type of story called an African Thumbling story. And in the essay by Christine Goldberg, The Dwarf and the Giant, she discusses how there's a common kind of story trope that exists throughout the Middle East and Africa. And in this story, you have the kind of core, at the core of it, you have 7 brothers and 7 sisters The sisters are the daughters of an ogress. The men will come trying to court her daughters, and in the nighttime, she will kill them. The 7 brothers go, their youngest brother follows along, their tiniest younger brother follows along, and when the ogress trying to kill them, he tricks the ogress, he switches the bodies of the daughters and of the brothers, so she ends up killing her own daughters instead, and she also eats them, I forgot to mention. She slits throat, she ends up killing her daughters instead, and the brothers escape. That is the main premise of the story. Other aspects of it change depending on where the story is being told from. In Debbo, Engal, and Fereyel, it is based on that primary core story, but it's the additional elements that I feel and the kind of way that they're told that I feel is very similar to Kirikou. Now, this recording was in 1978. I don't know if Michel Ocelot heard this specific recording, but there are a lot of similarities. I could find, in West Africa, I found one specific group of people that told that same type of story as cited in the essay, and this was the Lela people who live in Burkina Faso. And funnily enough, the only record I could find of this group of people was on a Christian missionary website. I just thought that was kind of funny that, that the only kind of like written record aside from the essay that I've read was that the Lela people live in Burkina Faso and they have been touched by God. I thought that was kind of funny. But it's possible that Michel Ocelot could have came across these stories in Guinea because Burkina Faso does neighbor the country. Or he heard the story from somewhere else. But it does bear a lot of similarities to Debbo, Engal, and Fereyel, and I will get into that. So it starts out in a very similar way. Fereyel comes out of the womb and he asks his mother, "Mother, where are my brothers?" She says, "Oh, well, they have gone to Debbo, Engal, the witch's house, and they are in great danger." Fereyel says, "Oh, I will go and protect them." He hides within his brother's clothes and stuff like that and ends up coming along with them. And he saves them, he switches out the bodies, and when they leave, the witch comes back after them and she transforms into a variety of things, trying to trick and capture Fereyel and his brothers. So she transforms herself into a log, into a tree, into a donkey, and into a maiden at the end. The first 3 times, Kirikou always notices that is sorcery, and that is the work of Debbo, Engal, and he tells his brothers to leave, to go away, to stop what they're doing. They listen to him, and they get away. The last time, she transforms herself into a maiden, and Fereyel ends up strangling her after she transforms into a snake and tries to kill him. So in Kirikou, you see something very similar in the way that the story begins, where Kirikou asks his mother, "Where are your uncles?" And she says, "Oh, well, they have all been captured by Karaba, the witch." And then she says, "But one of your uncles is going to confront her." And he goes, "Oh, I will go and I will help him." So automatically, just off the womb, he goes and tries to help his uncle. He hides in his uncle's clothes and helps his uncle escape from Karaba by tricking her. After the fact, Karaba does come back in multiple forms and tries to trick Kirikou and the other children in the village. In the Kirikou version, the children, however, they don't really listen to Kirikou, and Kirikou ends up having to save them. So they're on a raft. They are all getting on a raft, and it starts going towards Karaba's house. Kirikou has to pop it. They all are climbing in this magical tree that Karaba had created. They get captured, and Kirikou has to cut it down in order to save them. Another inspiration that is also a thumbling story as well is the story of Izegani. So a South African academic, Sani Bshali, this is what she cites as the primary source of inspiration for Kirikou. I could not find access to an English translation of this text, but she stated that it is a story about a tiny little boy who is saving his village from an evil sorceress. So I think that does set up the kind of premise of Kirikou, whereas a lot of the individual plot elements are very similar to the story of Debbo, Engal, and Fereyel. But other things that Kirikou adapts from African folklore is kind of the general style of it. So it has the beats of the dialogue, the way that people speak. It's very reminiscent of when you're reading African folklore or French translated versions of African folklore. Even English translations that are translated by African English speakers, it's very reminiscent of that. It also has a very character-focused narrative, where a lot of times in African folklore, you'll have one specific character, and the importance is really what that character represents, and you'll find different stories told about that character in a variety of situations. Kirikou does replicate this style of storytelling, and you can see this just in the fact that that is what enabled Kirikou in order to have 2 sequels that all, I think they mostly take place within the same kind of span of the first movie. So it's kind of just like all of his little adventures. So it's more about Kirikou and what he represents rather than this like overarching plot or storyline that one story represents morality. It's like this one character in different instances. This can be seen in the Anansi stories, where you have the Anansi the spider, who is in a variety of different situations, interacting with different characters, but it's all based around Anansi and his family, and different things about the story change. Additionally, song is used in Kirikou in a different way than European folklore. So in African stories, you do see song used very predominantly. And François Equilbecq writes about this, and he writes about how at first when he would hear about people saying how they would use songs telling stories, he wouldn't really believe it, but once he got there, he would see that their stories always included the telling of as well. And he did include this in his work, transcribed into his work, but of course not without the musical notes. But Kirikou does have these kinds of songs included into the story, and dance is also included. You cannot definitively say if it's used in an authentic way, because the songs that Equilbecq is writing about are used when telling the story by the people telling the story. So having the characters in the movie sing the songs, and also the timing that they sang songs in the story, I felt was a little bit questionable in terms of how the characters were represented. So yes, it included the songs. It's not your typical Disney ballad type songs. It makes sense for the setting and for what the story is saying that it's representing. Basically, the villagers have been told that their water supply has been cut off. They think that Karaba the sorceress is the one who cut off their water supply, who took away their water away. Kirikou's like, oh, are you sure it's Karaba? They're like, yes, or she's a sorceress, she took it away. Kirikou goes to inspect. He finds that there is a water demon inside of the water hole. He kills it. The water comes flowing out. When the villagers see this, they all start singing and dancing, and it takes them a while to recognize that Kirikou has actually died. And he later does come to life, and the villagers are compassionate, but just that initial portrayal of them showing joy, them like celebrating before showing compassion and empathy for wondering what happened to Kirikou, I feel it's a questionable portrayal, and it hints at how the villagers are portrayed throughout the story. They don't really have a lot of agency, a lot of character. They're mostly just background characters. There's Kirikou's mother and his grandfather, and they're portrayed in kind of specific ways, which does connect to how African people value their family, which is something that François Equilbecq writes about. He says that they have strong familial ties, and they have a lot of value to their parents and to their grandparents, to the elders. But the rest of the villagers, they don't have a lot of nuance, a lot of characterization. And I find this questionable because even Equilbecq writes that the dumb villager, the naive, stupid villager trope that you do see in European folklore, where the people, they're just not very smart, they're not very intelligent or rational. He says that is not found in African indigenous folklore. So it's a questionable portrayal for Ocelot to portray the people this way, without any agency, without any really thought. Kirikou's the only one asking questions. Why is Karaba evil? Oh, she's just evil. Did Karaba take away the water supply? Yes, she took it away. They also have the assumption that Karaba was eating the people, which is also wrong. And they don't listen to Kirikou when he's telling them, hey, that's sorcery, don't listen to that. They don't listen to him. They just they're like, oh, don't be silly, Kirikou, we know what sorcery is. Also kind of being like prideful and dismissive. So it's a lot of negative representations there, which is not accurate. It also kind of has like a misogynistic approach as well, where the men are really the dynamic characters that are moving the plot forward. Even though the antagonist Karaba is a woman, it's Kirikou who ends up having to save her. And Seni Mshali also cites that she sees the as a direct representation of France and West Africa's colonial relationship, where she says that the way that Kirikou goes to his grandfather and asks, hey, why is Karaba evil? And he's the one who finally answers him and tells him, well, she had been attacked by a group of men, and they penetrated her spine with a poisonous thorn. And all you have to do is remove that thorn, and it will remove her powers, and it will remove her pain, and it will remove her evil. And then Kirikou goes, he takes the thorn out with his teeth. He asks Kadaba for a kiss. She kisses him. He grows into a adult man, and they're like get married or something. It's kind of a left turn ending. But, you know, Kirikou is a little boy who goes and saves Kadaba from her trauma and from her pain. And it's his grandfather who told him to do this. And the villagers are kind of portrayed as just like mindless happenings going on. And they're really at the sake of Kirikou and his grandfather as well. And she said that that's kind of a portrayal of where the grandfather is France, and you have to go to France, ask them for advice in order to protect and save and rectify the mindless African people. Other things that aren't really found in African folklore is the sexual assault narrative. So Kadaba, when she's attacked by men, it's really more of an assault, and even just the way that it's the imaging of this in the movie, the visual representation of it in the movie, makes it kind of clear. Any review that I looked at, people always assume, they can always recognize that this is an analogy to sexual assault. She's basically assaulted by a group of men, and it's the pain of that makes her then take the men from the village, and she doesn't really eat them, she turns them into her fetishes. So fetishes in African culture, or in Africa, it was a word that was used by the French or by the European colonial power, the British as well. They put the word to mention African spiritual items, so like a cow's head, or like anything, like any spiritual item would be called a fetish. So if you go to parts of Africa today, you can find African fetish markets where they will be selling these spiritual items. But in Kirikou, the fetishes are kind of like Kadaba's henchmen. And at the end of the film, it turns out that they were the men that she had taken, and she transformed them using a spell into her fetishes. And they all have these different powers, and their design is also very out of place. They have like a very robotic design. So it is kind of out of place, and it's not representative of any part of African folklore. You don't find a story about sexual assault in the same way that you do in Kadaba. It also has a very modern way of storytelling where the character has a lot of like nuance, and it's kind of like, not necessarily nuanced, but it's this idea of like retribution, of the villain is the true victim after all. I feel like these are more so character types that you see a lot in modern media rather than folklore, which tends to kind of have very strict good and bad characters because they're usually a representation of morality. So it is questionable why he included this, as it's not found in African folklore. And with the way that people, and even François Equilbecq, view Black sexuality, it's questionable why he included a narrative about a group of Black men gang raping a Black woman, and they have violent response. It's a violent action, and it has a violent response on Kadaba's end, where she then goes and she attacks an entire village. So I don't know why you have these violent portrayals of African sexuality when it's not found in folklore and when it is a children's movie. Yeah, so you have to question these changes in making the African people kind of mindless, the changes in Kadaba's storyline, and even the generalization of the story as a whole. Why did Ocelot choose to put these things in here when he knows he's representing a culture that is rarely ever shown in a good light, that people already have negative misconceptions about? And this is further amplified by the overall setting of the story, where it's very placeless and it's very timeless. Many stories are relative to a place in time. Some, because of the history of oral folklore, there are some stories that are just like in a place and in a time, and these tend to be fables. But a lot of stories about a specific hero or about a specific person, they do tend to be in a setting and in a time. And the thing is, Africa had different civilizations, had different kingdoms, had different impacts on their stories. And even Ocelot, he writes that he'll be writing about different portions of the people that he's talking to about their folklore, and he'll say, oh, well, actually this is probably Islamic influence, this might be Islamic influence, and you'll see similarities between folklore in the Middle East and in Africa. So you have to question when and where is this story coming from, because it impacts what it means and why it's told. But none of this plays a part in Kirikou. In Kirikou, there's no distinct civilization based on their outfits, based on the setting, based on what they're going through. You can't point to a specific place or time in Africa, which kind of makes it seem like Africa has no historical context. Its whole history is just one long stretch of nothingness before France arrived. So the clothing, it's very plain. They just have like colorful wrapped garments and they're depicted topless. I do think you have to question why they're depicted as topless, as like I said, Islam had a great influence in the country, and Ocelot said he would see village women topless or having exposed breasts. But I do question this. I don't know how often he saw this, enough to the point where he decided to make every female character topless in the movie when there's no date and time. So, you know, if it's later in time, it makes sense. But if it's at a time where there is Islamic influence, and there has been Islamic influence for a long time, the time when the stories were collected, there was Islamic influence, and Africans had to be more modest after colonization. I do question why he decided to portray them that way, especially when the rest of their wear doesn't specifically denote a specific culture or a specific tribe. The use of patterns, Karab is the only one who has any use of patterns, and the rest of the villagers, their dress, you can't really place it. It's not representative of any West African culture. Different African cultures, their traditional dress, their ancient dress, it's very unique and it's very elaborate. Every single group you look at, and you just have to wonder, why didn't Kirikou want to look into that, want to represent that? They just bought into the idea of these kind of like basic, primitive look. It's more of a stylistic choice. The hair is the same way. It looks, when you look at it, it evokes understandings of Africanness. There are some hairstyles that I saw that I did see traditional basis for, like the braids poking out like this, and there's a traditional Fulani hairstyle that has a rounded braid like this, and Kirikou's mom has like little braids in her head like that. So there are similarities there, but overall, you can't point to a specific culture or a specific group of people, and specific groups of people do have different ways of wearing their hair. So it has this kind of mushed together view of African dress and African hair that it's not genuine. And additionally, Kirikou's grandfather is wearing Egyptian styled clothing. He has an Egyptian robe, an Egyptian beard thing, and an Egyptian crown. So that's very questionable. Why the most wise man in the film is dressed in Egyptian garb and is more modest compared to everybody else in the movie. It's questionable. Yeah, and it's definitely a stylistic choice. The architecture, Sanim Chali, she states that the architecture is different from traditionally West African architecture, but I found similarities to specifically the Fulani people in Guinea in terms of what their architecture looks like. So that does seem to be accurate there. In conclusion, it does a little bit in terms of alluding to Africa and African history, but you can't, after watching Kirikou, you can't say that you know any more about African folklore, about African history, or about African culture, West African culture. You can't say that you know any more about it because it doesn't have historical accuracy or authenticity to any specific time, group, or place. So it really just hegemonizes the perspective of Africa, and it ends up not representing anybody at all. You know, the style of dialogue, the generalized tones, the style of it, the character design, of course, it all is definitely African in a general sense. But this general idea of African and of African folklore comes from France's colonial understandings and colonial conclusions, racist conclusions that they drew about a place. So Kirikou can't be accurate and it cannot be authentic because that's what it's standing upon as its base of understanding, as its base of saying, I know enough about you to tell a story about you. You know, that's the end.